please, let's not abandon the workers in environmentally sensitive industries, because when we abandon them, we're just handing them over to right-wing populism.
A just transition. How to support workers while fighting climate change. Next on A Third of Your Life.
You spend a third of your life at work. We're all about making it better. This is the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations podcast.
Jobs versus the environment. That's one of the old narratives in the fight to curb greenhouse gas emissions. But advocates say it is possible to switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy without leaving workers in the dust. Welcome to A Third of Your Life. I'm Steve Flamish, and our guest host is Todd Vachon, an assistant professor in the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations and director of the Labor Education Action Research Network, LEARN. In this episode, Todd discusses his new book, Clean Air and Good Jobs, and he talks to three of his fellow experts in the field. Now, on A Third of Your Life, Todd Vachon.
In 1989, at the age of 13, I learned two valuable lessons. The first was the importance of unions for building and supporting the middle class, and the second was that burning fossil fuels was warming the planet and would one day have serious consequences for life on Earth. The first was learned through personal experience, the second in a classroom. At the time, my family owned a small business, a general store and gas station, in a small town in eastern Connecticut. Due to market forces, including the rise of corporate chain stores, my parents' business was struggling. By 1989, we were facing bankruptcy. Fortunately, there was a rising demand for skilled construction workers at the time, and through his friend network in the volunteer fire department, my father was able to join the local carpenters union and immediately began working in the industry, including at several local power plants. Within a year of his becoming a union carpenter, our family experienced a transition from being working poor to being middle class. We had health insurance. I got glasses and braces, and my dad built our family home, the same home I now bring my children to visit as he enjoys his retirement thanks to the union pension. Around the same time that we were experiencing those economic hardships in the late 1980s, NASA climate scientist James Hansen explained to Congress and the world that the heat-trapping gases emitted by the burning of fossil fuels were pushing global temperatures higher. Hansen's remarks marked the official opening of the age of climate change. The following school year, I learned about the greenhouse effect in science class, and my mind was open to the possibility that human activity was changing the planet, and not in a good way. In the 34 years since Hansen's testimony, the scientific community has affirmed that climate change is a serious cause for concern. Extreme weather events, including hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and droughts, have become more frequent, more intense, and longer in duration. Yet, annual greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow and were 44% higher in 2022 than they were in 1989. During that same period, private sector union density in the United States declined from 14% of workers in 1989 to just 6% in 2022. As a result, income inequality has soared as much as greenhouse gas emissions, with the top 1% of earners now taking home 16% of all income, while the middle-class share of income has plummeted. Some of the major causes of union decline include outsourcing of manufacturing, eroding employment in highly unionized industries, and rabid anti-unionism on the part of employers taking advantage of weak labor law protections for workers. Today, many of the remaining good private sector union jobs are in the energy sector, often involving fossil fuels, while many of the new renewable energy and green economy jobs are not unionized, and attempts to do so face an uphill battle against hostile employers. This has led many blue-collar unionized workers in the U.S. to adopt a jobs versus the environment perspective, fighting to save good jobs in fossil fuel-related industries by resisting measures to decarbonize the economy. As the son of a union carpenter and a former carpenter myself, but also the father of 3 children growing up in a steadily warming world, I struggled with this dilemma. How can we ensure our kids and their generation can afford to make a living with good jobs and benefits, like my father did, and also have a planet that will support that living? Grappling with this question led to my spending 10 years participating in the nascent labor climate movement as an activist and a researcher, and documenting those experiences and findings in my book, Clean Air and Good Jobs. The solution to this dilemma that was most commonly put forth by labor climate activists was a just transition. But what is a just transition? How can we achieve one? And why do we even need one? To address these questions and learn more about just transition, I'm bringing in the voices of 3 experts on the topic. Les Leopold is the director of the Labor Institute and author of The Man Who Hated Work and Loved Labor, The Life and Times of Tony Mazzocchi. Mijin Cha is assistant professor of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And Dimitris Stevis is professor of politics at Colorado State University, where he is also co-founder of the Center for Environmental Justice. Dimitris is author of Just Transitions, Promise and Contestation. And for full disclosure, Mijin, Dimitris, and I have collaborated on research reports previously, including the Just Transition Listening Project, which was conducted in partnership with the Labor Network for Sustainability, and which will inform much of today's conversation. But let's start with Les. Hi, Les. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
So you literally wrote the book on Tony Mazzocchi, the person who is credited with coming up with this concept of a just transition. Can you give us the backstory and some historical context for the origins of the concept?
So let me walk through what he had in mind and how it led to just transition. First of all, his mission in life was to build a radical anti-corporate labor movement. That's what he was about, starting in the late 1940s onward. And the problem in doing that, he grew up in the labor movement during McCarthyism, the Korean War, and so on. He knew from the get-go that the workers he was trying to organize could either go right or left. That right-wing populism that we talk about right now was something he was concerned with right from the beginning. His method, as it turned out, after in the 1960s, he basically discovered that the workplace was an absolute mess. And out of his work, his educational work, his agitation grew the occupational safety and health movement. And he thought that was the key to building a radical labor movement, because he didn't think capitalism could solve that problem, that it was a contradiction, that you could make work safer, but you couldn't make it safe enough to save these workers from having basically a dramatically shortened lifetime. All right, so that was the basic framework. So he thought he had it made, really, by the end of the 60s and early 70s, and he was very active with the environmental movement. And then he made another discovery. He realized that everything that the members of his union produced was toxic and would have to be eliminated. He also realized very early on, he was the first labor person to get involved in climate change, as far as I know, held the first conference with labor people on climate change, brought Hansen in to talk to them. He realized that that was going to add another dimension of making a lot of work expendable, something that had to go to save the planet and to save the lives of people all in the community and the society in general. And his line at that point was something like, you know, we lived for 5,000 years without plastics. We're going to have to do so again. And that meant all the chemical workers that he was representing probably should lose their jobs. So he's facing a critical problem. And of course, because his base made all these toxics, he had a big problem. He had to figure out some way to relate to them, especially the nuclear weapons production workers. He represented them, atomic workers. And he would talk to them. He'd say, this was as the nuclear testing stopped and it looked like the Cold War was coming to an end. He talked to them and he said, what are you going to do when peace breaks out? Demand more nuclear weapons? You can't do that. So he needed something for them. And then he made a conceptual leap that I don't know anybody else that would have dared make it. He basically said, we got to pay these people not to work. And again, his famous line was, I realized that work was shit. That's why I became a labor bureaucrat. And he said, I've never met a labor person who got on staff that ever wanted to go back on the line. Once they're out, they don't want to go back. And he took it even another step further. He started to challenge. He said, look, I experienced the GI Bill of Rights at the end of World War II, and they paid us to go to school. I got a living wage. He went to dental repair school for several years, got a living wage. The tuition was free. The government paid for that. It was actually higher than Harvard's, this ripoff school he went to. But anyway, he was saying that I got paid. My job was to go to school. And he called this redefined work. And he said to us, he said, look, what you do at the Labor Institute, you call it work, but how do you compare it to Dave Campbell's oil workers who go inside a very toxic facility every day? Management tells them what to do. How do you compare? How is that work? Is your work really work? Or is it just the only thing you have in common is you get paid for what you're doing? But your job is golden compared to theirs. And he said, why can't working people have that same experience? If they've spent their lives working in a fossil fuel industry or a toxic industry, and now we're telling them they can no longer work there, why shouldn't they get the experience of getting paid to go to school, or just getting paid in general for a period of time, and not having to continually suffer? And certainly not suffer for a decision that benefits the entire society. This is where this guy's head was at. So at first, we thought he was crazy. That you can't pay people not to work. That's not right. No one will buy that. And he just kept saying, you guys are wrong. You don't get it. You know, we got to do something like that. Finally, actually, the person that turned us around was our colleague, Mike Merrill from Rutgers, from Learn, same program as Todd's, who said, no, he's right. He's right. And we started talking, and the Superfund legislation had passed. So we called the program Superfund for Workers, and it was something like 4 years, full pay and benefits plus free tuition. At least got him to go down to 4 years. He wanted it forever, but okay, he agreed to 4 years. Okay, so the first incident that could have made this really relevant was Ciba Geigy in Toms River, New Jersey. Now, this is your example of what happens when you don't have a program. That local was very active in occupational safety and health, was a big backer of the work Rick Engler was doing with the Work Environment Council in New Jersey. They were strong support, progressive people. And then it became apparent that something was wrong in the community of Toms River. And there were clusters of cancer. Kids were getting cancer. And Greenpeace got involved. And they climbed the smokestack and did their thing and stopped up the effluent pipe that went out half a mile into the ocean and was polluting the beach. And mothers went on the march. And what did the local do? Tony was not their representative at this point. He was not in office. What did they do? They did a counter march against the mothers. I remember Mizaki said, you got to be crazy. You're going to march against mothers who are protecting their kids from cancer? How can you do this? They didn't listen. The place was shut down. That local set up a political action committee to fight environmental regulations even after the local was shut down. And I'm sure a ton of those people ended up being what we call the right-wing populists now, the Trump supporters. And Tony's line at that point, he was trying to tell environmentalists, if we don't do something for them, they're going to eat you for lunch. So we tried to move this dialogue around the country through education. That's what we do. And we got a dialogue going at the AFL-CIO nationally. And it didn't go too well there. The mine workers pretty much shut it down. We did have some luck with the atomic workers, though, because they were starting to do cleanup projects. What was it, $50 billion was set aside, $70 billion for cleaning up the facilities. And one worker, atomic worker, put up a sign, said, treat workers like dirt. gave us a just transition. And we got something actually worked out there where they got the right to transfer to clean up jobs, et cetera. But really they didn't get a full just transition. But at least the concept gave them a direction to go into.
Wow, such a rich history. And I know that some of this work took place at our own Labor Education Center here at Rutgers University as well. So, we know that the concept of just transition originates from Tony Mazaki's work, but it's also my understanding that you had something to do with the use of the term, just transition.
In 1995, this is my one claim to fame in all this. I was representing the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. Mazaki was actually out of office, and that was a great base to work from because you could invite in environmental groups for education and have great dialogue. Anyway, they sent me to speak at the Great Lakes Conference, a treaty conference between, it's a treaty organization between the United States and Canada. It was in Duluth. And I gave what we call the speech. It was the first time I ever made a public address while I was at the Labor Institute. And just before getting on the stage, there was another guy there named Brian Kohler from Canadian Energy and Paper Workers, who used to be, when that district was in the Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers, he was a member of the Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers, and now was their environmental health and safety coordinator. And we were talking back and forth, and I showed him what I was going to talk about. And we sort of came together and we said, super fun, terrible. Nobody likes that. Let's call it just transition. So we both got up and gave our speech and used the word just transition for the first time. And Brian is the international ever ready bunny for just transition. He moved it all over the world, all by himself. And he's the person that's responsible for moving it through the various labor movements in Europe, and then getting it into the Paris Peace Accords and into the dialogue. So if there's ever a peace prize given out for just transition, internationally, he should get it.
That's a great story, and so interesting to be able to connect all the dots. I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you about was the relationship between environmental justice and just transition. We know that there's been a history of exclusion in hiring and also by unions as well in terms of workers of color and from different backgrounds not being able to access the good jobs in the fossil fuel sector. But we also know the history of environmentalism in the United States has meant that a lot of the most polluting and toxic facilities are often sited in communities of color and low-income frontline communities. So within the U.S. context currently, the concept of just transition seems to be getting embraced more vigorously by environmental and climate justice activists than labor activists. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of that, about how the concept of just transition permeated from labor spaces into environmental justice spaces domestically within the U.S.?
Somebody told me, you should not just be talking to the big Anglo environmental groups. How about talking to the environmental justice networks? And Dave Campbell and I went on a Maquiladoras trip with them, got to know them a little bit better, started doing joint education. And they said, hey, you know what? What about the communities? We get you on the workers, but we're really interested in transition for the communities. We like that phrase. I was actually incredibly impressed that they liked that phrase. So we started all kinds of conversations, summit meetings between labor leaders and environmental justice leaders, and God only knows the various things. I literally can't remember anymore. But out of it came the Just Transition Alliance. Janice, Jose, others ran with that thing. And from where I sit, it looks like they're the equivalent of Brian Kohler in moving it throughout the United States. So now everybody and their uncle uses just transition, usually means 10 different things by it. And I'm just hoping that we can keep the worker portion involved. And so here's my key takeaway. Please, let's not abandon the workers in environmentally sensitive industries, because when we abandon them, we're just handing them over to right-wing populism. And Mazaki, I think, was right that they can go either way. if we do the education, if we do the grassroots organizing, and if we have a dialogue. But if we write them off or come up with feel-good things like it's going to be win-win for everybody, they won't have to do anything special for them, and it's going to cost too much money. If we wanted to do a just transition that was fair both to the environmentally sensitive workers and to communities, it can be done. The question is whether we have the will, whether we have the conceptual apparatus that Miyazaki had to push and push and push until he changed the way the world thought.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Les, for putting this all into such great historical perspective for us. Now, to get a better sense of why a just transition is so crucial at the current historical juncture, we're going to turn to Mijin Cha of UC Santa Cruz. Mijin has researched the topic extensively and is a co-author of the Just Transition Listening Project, which was a community-based research project conducted in partnership between the Labor Network for Sustainability, several community partner organizations, and 4 academic researchers. The project interviewed over 100 workers and community members who had faced, were currently facing, or anticipated facing some form of economic transition to find out what their experiences had been and what it was or what they could use to make a transition more palatable and less painful for themselves, their family, and their communities. Hi, Mijin. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Todd.
So we have spoken before and even written together about the inevitability of transitions, that the only real constant is actually change. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think what we want to point out is that transition itself, in and of itself, is not necessarily unjust, right? Like there's transitions all the time, particularly as our economy evolves, we can expect and we should expect transitions, but it's that our response to them is so inadequate that makes them unjust. So the existence of transitions in and of themselves is not the issue that causes this injustice, but our inability to both react to them, but also react in a way that protects workers and communities is what makes it unjust. So we have these cycles of declining industries, like the textile industry, the manufacturing industry. We have had several industrial transitions. So saying that fossil fuel transitions is just the latest inevitable transition. So again, there's nothing inherently wrong about transition. And as our economies and our societies evolve, arguably as we evolve away from fossil fuels so that we can protect our planet, and have a future for humanity, fossil fuels will be the last transition of what is an inevitable transition. So what can be done? What we want to think about is what can be done in transition while workers still have power. So part of the issue that we heard, part of the problem was that there's really no notice period before things start to shut down. And so when things are shutting down, everybody then is negotiating from a position of precarity, right? They don't know what will happen in the future. They don't know what will happen with their jobs. They don't know what will happen with their community. And when you negotiate from a place of fear, you're unable to think both broadly and widely. So you can't think about what do we need in 5 years, what do we need in 10 years, and what would be the best overall transition package. You're thinking what's going to happen in 6 months when I lose my job, right? What will happen? Where will I find this money? Where will I find my health insurance? So what we found is that, when we think about the fossil fuel transition, we are just at the beginning of it. So really now is the time when we should be thinking about transition plans so that workers can have the maximum amount and communities can have the maximum amount of power in these negotiations as we transition away from the fossil fuel sector.
Yeah, good point.
And the other point is that we still don't know what we are transitioning into as we transition away from fossil fuels. So the renewable energy future, as many of us know, there's a geographic disconnect. So where jobs are being lost in fossil fuel regions is not necessarily where renewable jobs are being created. And we also know that renewable energy jobs have much lower rates of unionization and pay much less. So when, some of the fossil fuel workers that we were talking to, it's not that they are, I think this is a really important point of that. It's not that they're ideologically opposed per se to climate change. Of course, there are those that are, but, we are asking them to leave a secure employment present for an unknown employment future.
Right. No, that's a really good point. Can you talk a little bit more about that tension and maybe bring it into historical context?
What creates even more of this tension and uncertainty is that we have a history of unjust transitions. So if we think about globalization, the past industrial transitions of globalization and deindustrialization, we were largely unable to support workers and communities. And what that means is that workers were largely unable to be placed in jobs that paid similar wages with similar benefits. And communities really had no transition support. So, we saw this large swath of what they call dead towns across the Midwest, across the Northeast. As these industries left, those towns just kind of died, figuratively and literally. So we had some transition assistance programs like the Trade Adjustment Act, but they were not really robust enough to meet the demand of the problem. So there was some transition support, and some workers were helped, and some communities were helped, but it was never able to meet the scale of the demand. And the other thing that we found was that work closures are more than just your loss of job, that it actually leads to the social fabric disintegration. So a loss of identity amongst workers, workers had become, tied to the work as their identity. And because there was so much despair, that it actually led to ways of suicide amongst workers, and a feeling that they are really treated as though they're disposable, right? Especially in the cases where they just had, bit by bit shutdowns. They really felt like we are just disposable. Nobody really cares about us, and nobody is really helping us. And so, we talk a lot about unemployment benefits, and how to, what happens in the absence of work. And we talk much less about what happens to the social fabric disintegration when these plants and industries start to shut down.
So we've had all these unjust transitions historically in auto and paper and steel. The defining issue of our time today is climate change. It will have obvious ramifications for fossil fuel workers, but I often note that the number of coal mining jobs has declined precipitously in recent decades, and due largely to technological changes, efficiency improvements, and market forces like the rise of cheaper natural gas. So who are the types of workers we should be looking at when considering the energy transition? And to what should they be transitioning?
So something that we also heard was that, there's a lot of attention on fossil fuel workers. How do we transition coal miners? How do we transition oil and gas workers? And we don't talk as much about people who are excluded from these industries in the first place due to histories of racism and sexism. So if we focus just on the fossil fuel workers, we actually are not having a just transition, because there is a whole slew of workers that were excluded from this economic activity in the first place. And then, when we think about what skills are transferable, we want to get away from thinking prescriptively about fossil fuel workers need to then transition into clean energy jobs, or things like coal miners will become coders, right? These are kind of ridiculous statements that don't really resonate with workers. And instead, we should really think about place-based quality job creation, so that people can choose what industry they want to transition into, and be less prescriptive about, now you have to install solar, even though you used to be an oil refinery worker. And then, of course, COVID exposed the depths of how inadequate our safety net is. And this is extremely important also as we think about it, transitioning away from fossil fuels. We can't, when we often hear about the rural region in Germany, which also transitioned away from coal mining and steel manufacturing, but the safety net in Germany is on a whole different level than safety net here in the US. So even if they lose a generation of workers, which they didn't have nearly the length of the depth of despair that happens here to workers, because we just don't have adequate unemployment supports. We don't have adequate relocation support. We don't have health. We know that, we could go on and on about how terrible our social fabric and safety net is in the US.
Yeah, the social safety net is definitely weaker here in the U.S. relative to other rich countries. And that seems like it would have to play a big piece of making a transition more just. But in my own research, I found that the pervasiveness of neoliberalism, really the belief that the government should play little to no role in the economy, has tampered the demands by many workers and many unions for expanding these sorts of benefits, or really even of thinking of unions as vehicles for broader social change beyond just bread and butter issues for their members. Any thoughts on this or insight that you can offer from your research?
This was somewhat generational, but what we heard from younger workers is that they don't just care about work, they care about climate change, they care about student debt, right? They care about a lot of things beyond just work, which is an evolution kind of about how labor unions have traditionally been in the US, right? So they don't see their identity just as a union worker anymore. They, especially if they're workers of color, like when there was when there's racial unrest, they really deeply feel the racial unrest. And so their concerns are not just economic, they're not just labor, right? And seeing workers as a whole, as more than just their job, helps really more fully express this.
To build upon this idea of whole worker and get a better sense of what a just transition could entail, we're going to bring in another co-author of the Just Transition Listening Project, Dimitris Stevis.
Hi, Todd.
Hi, Dimitris. In my own research, I've found just transition to be very difficult to define, in part because it is used so differently by so many different people. As you know, I've identified 3 distinct but nested frames, which I refer to as protective, proactive, and transformative. But you've done some classification work of your own on the different dimensions of transition. Could you speak a little bit about that, about the scale, scope, and ambition of just transition?
Something doesn't have to be called a just transition to be a just transition. It could be integrated into the existing policies, into other policies. Certainly that's more apparent in social welfare European countries, but even in some instances in the United States where, in fact, transitions do include justice and pretty rigorous justice provisions. And finally, there can be implicit just transitions, much weaker, but prefiguring, showing us the direction towards a more complete just transition. In terms of scale, we think about space and time. One of the things that became very apparent is that people did recognize that you need to think about just transitions across value chains, not just your small worlds. Not everybody did, but many people did. We have to ask the question of whether the just transition policy is limited to an economic unit or a small political jurisdiction versus the whole country, whether it's only limited to a part of the production network, maybe the production of energy, but not the transportation of energy. And those are very practical things. How far into the past does it reach? As I said, it was very important for indigenous people, but for others too. You know, what do you clean? How long in the past do you go to attribute responsibility? And how far into the future do you reach? Are you going to say that we're going to shut down certain plants? We're going to do certain things for 5 or 10 years and not worry about actually ensuring that the transitional policies do in fact deal with the impact of the transition. We have to ask the question, do we just deal with industries that are sunsetting? What about the industries that are emerging, like renewables? And what about transitions within existing industries that are not going anywhere? Health, we talk to so many health workers, or transportation. We have to ask the question of whether just transition policies are for some workers, perhaps leaving out contract workers or women or people of color. Same thing with communities, perhaps affecting and benefiting certain people. Some are more affluent, but not the poor. But one of the things that, at least to me, and I believe to all of us, became apparent is that we have to pay attention not only to sectoral transitions, but also demographic and social transitions, whether they have to do with the emancipation of people of color or women or immigrants. And those are very, very important transitions. And we think that somehow our focus on conventional sectors can obscure the fact that those transitions, those social and demographic transitions, are equally important. And we could see them everywhere. We could see them when women would tell us, women workers, that how they were affected by the pandemic. They were the ones that stay at home to take care of children. So that has had an impact on them. It's affecting their transition towards emancipation. From that, we try to derive some sense of the ambition of the visions that people told us. Which means how deeply a just transition policy aims to address the causes of unjust transitions. To make it short, an important lesson that we learned is that all people gravitated towards ambitious policy interventions when talking about solutions to their problems and those of their loved ones. And I want to underscore that, really ambitious. Calls for the government to step in and take care of pensions, to take care of healthcare, to take care of education. Those things cannot take place without a rethinking of the social welfare state and the social welfare network. However, these preferences are not always combined into a more comprehensive vision. So there was a certain degree of large particularism and some problems in terms of putting all those individual desires and demands together. However, a whole bunch of people did, in fact, have a much more comprehensive vision.
So I want to think about this idea of a broader vision for a moment and bringing together all of these individual pieces to build a transition that's actually, more transformative in nature, something that's not only addressing the immediate concerns in one locality for one group of people, but something that's a little bit more broad and is encompassing and addressing some of the structural features of our current economy and society to better prepare the future history of humanity for the other inevitable transitions that are coming down the pipe. Mijin, do you have any thoughts or anything you'd like to add on this?
the just transition is more than just what happens to your job. It's about what do we think about this relationship to extraction, right? And not just extraction of resources, but extraction of labor, extraction of wealth, extraction of people through incarceration. As we transition away from extraction, we need to think about regeneration, and that includes relationship to land. It includes things like more just provisions, a more just society. So when we think about the problem is not just about the loss of work, but really as we think about moving from extraction to something else, like what is that something else that we are moving towards?
So what we're talking about here is not merely an expansion of the social welfare state and the provision of benefits to workers, right? We're thinking more about transitioning society as a whole to a more sustainable and equitable future. But it seems to me, based on what I've heard so far, that welfare state provisions do have to play some piece in that. Is that right?
On one hand, one can see that very explicitly as part of a dramatic transformation. On the other hand, one can see that as a practical expansion of the social welfare state. And the original proposal for just transition in the 1990s, which talks about retraining, slide path to retirement, and so on. The idea was that the Just Transition Fund would be part of the social welfare state. It would be something like the super fund, like some Social Security. I may say, well, that seems quite limited, but if one steps back and says, what if we did have a Just Transition Fund that was funded in a public way, whether through taxes, through contribution by corporation, but it was there. It was part of the bargain that we have in the United States to take care of workers over a period of 4, 5, 6 years in every transition. That in itself, although it might sound limited, would be a dramatic transformation. And clearly the people who are opposed to the public sphere recognize that. And we see that in the opposition to Medicare for all and everything that has to do with the public welfare. But you can say here we have an egalitarian social ecological state, we have reached Shangri-La, whatever you want to call it, and the just transition is part of it. Or you can say Just Transition Fund is adopted, it's like Social Security, and that would be a major transformation. That would not be a small transformation. On the other hand, if you have little just transition policies taking care of particular plants, of particular cities, or particular sectors, then that really doesn't get us far.
So going beyond what a just transition might entail, I would like to hear a little bit about your thoughts on how palatable it is to the folks that would actually benefit the most from having a just transition. What is the view and the opinion of an idea of a just transition among the working class in the fossil fuel sector, for example? Mijin?
On another research project that I did, we talked to some folks in Appalachia about this idea of just transition. And one of our interviews was like, you people are ridiculous if you think that you can come into a state like Kentucky and say just transition and expect people to know that you mean family sustaining wages, low carbon, he's like, transition to what, right? Everyone goes through a transition, you go through a divorce, it's a transition. And then how could you possibly mean that, what do we mean by just? And so, I think what it was in relation to was, it was not an opposition to the energy transition, but the idea that you could replace organizing and community engagement with some terminology and expect to then build a movement is what he thought was ridiculous. And I think that's the point, is that, we can't just say just transition and then expect everyone to get on board, right? All of our successful examples, I don't even know if they actually necessarily use that term, but the idea that we are facing this, transition, something is going to close or something, will go away, and we want to envision a future for our community, that is something that you can then organize around, and then you then build a shared vision that you can then advance. But I think there is no term that can be a shortcut for that. We have come to use just transition in academia, amongst advocates, amongst policymakers. I think that's fine, but the idea that you could substitute terminology for organizing, I think, is what we have some resistance to. And the last point that I'll make is, because as you see just transition becoming mainstreamed, you see a lot of what I would consider to be neoliberal approaches that are saying just, equitable, and fair, just and equitable. But arguably, if a transition is just, it is also equitable and fair, right? So you can't make it more palatable if you use more terms, if you don't do the organizing to build the support for the idea in the first place.
Now you're talking my language. I think both of you know how much I believe organizing to be the most powerful and effective means by which to achieve, positive social change And the same is true with trying to achieve a just transition to a more sustainable and democratic and equitable future. Clearly, there's much more work to be done on that front, both in terms of ensuring that we're looking out for the displaced workers in the fossil fuel industry as we decarbonize the economy, but also addressing the historical injustices along the lines of race and gender in terms of employment in the new green economy, as well as the past harms done due to environmental racism. I'd like to thank Dimitris Stevis and Mijin Cha for joining me, as well as Les Leopold earlier to give us a history of just transition, why it's so important that we have a discussion around what a just transition is, and why it's so vitally important that we bring the workers and communities into the fold together to discuss what their needs really are to shape the policy moving forward. And that brings us to a close of this episode of A Third of Your Life. From the School of Management and Labor Relations, I'm Todd Vachon.
Thanks for listening to A Third of Your Life, the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations podcast. For more information on our academic programs, faculty, and research, visit smlr.rutgers.edu.